Christian excusagists will often talk about the cumulative case for Christianity, suggesting that you can't look at just this or that argument or alleged piece of evidence for something like the resurrection or God's existence. Rather, you have to look at all of the arguments and alleged evidence together, cumulatively. In this video, I want to ask Christians to consider the cumulative case against Christianity. And in making that case, we'll go from the general to the specific on a linear timeline. So, to begin with, Christians have to believe in God, who is not just any God, but the God, the one and only God, the sole necessary being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, and is, as the Torah clearly states, unquestionably one. Except he's also three, an idea which not only goes against the teachings of Moses and the Hebrew Bible, but is nowhere explicitly articulated by God's Son, Jesus, in the Gospels. Next, Christians have to believe that this God is a timeless, spaceless being who can yet somehow act and be the cause of, well, everything. You heard me. Despite existing outside time and space, this being, God, can somehow create, when the mere act of creating requires time. Even the creation of time requires time to already exist. This is no easy problem. Listen to Christian excusagist ordinaire William Lane Craig struggle with it.
So the insufficiency of the cause before, let's say, if it's the wrong language, but before the universe exists, the insufficiency of the cause, which means that it hasn't existed yet, is prior in explanation rather than prior in time.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that what you call the insufficiency of the cause is due to the fact that the free will of this being has not chosen to create the universe. This being has not made such a decision. But the instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being. Indeed, the decision is explanatorily prior to the first instant of time. You just have to be very careful if you're going to be philosophically precise to use tenseless verbs in your sentences and not use temporal particles like before or yet. The instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being. Indeed, the decision is explanatorily prior to the first instant of time.
Well, there you have it, my Christian friends. Problem solved, right? Things can happen prior to the first instance of time. Yeah, that makes sense, right? That makes perfect sense, right? Next, once this timeless being had somehow made the decision to create, which I know, decisions sound like they require time, right? But just stay with me. Once that decision had been made, Christians then have to believe that God either created the universe and everything in it within a very short period of time, some say as little as 6 days, or God initiated all of space, time, and matter and just let things evolve over the course of billions and billions of years. God's not really clear about this in his holy book. Or he is. And our universe is very young despite all appearance to the contrary. Which would mean that the vast majority of Christians, modern Christians, William Lane Craig included, are simply suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It also means that God is quite the prankster. Or is it the devil who makes everything look really old? Well, God allows it, so his bad, right? Whatever the case, Christians have to believe that God somehow decided, before the creation of time, to create a world he knew would, one way or another, be filled with wickedness and sin, which God hates more than anything. If our universe is indeed young, then sin filled the world only after a couple of clueless humans who almost literally just fell off the turnip truck got tricked into a life of sin by a talking snake, which God allowed in with these morons, knowing exactly how that would work out for his creation, hating sin and wickedness like he does. But if our universe is very old, then Christians have to believe that God created a universe with sin at the ready, just waiting for a species sentient enough to come along and bask in it as we do. Death and suffering too, which means this all good, infinitely good God also timelessly decided to create evil, which is something all timeless, spaceless, infinitely good beings do. I mean, everybody knows that, right? That's just axiomatic. This also means that our infinitely good God timelessly decided to use the brutal, heartless process of evolution to bring about his desired species, which, according to William Lane Craig, goes back as far as Homo heidelbergensis, up to 1 million years ago, meaning God let all the other non-hominid species battle it out, dying and suffering for nearly 1 billion years prior, when he could have just poofed the universe and all life into existence in an instant, being all-powerful as he is. Then, Christians have to believe that for the vast majority of that 1 million years since the appearance of Homo heidelbergensis, God decided to say nothing to the humans, for which the entire universe was created. He didn't tell anyone that we're all created in his image, having a special place of dignity and worth until 3,300 years ago. Instead, letting us all battle it out, killing one another off until it was just us, which I guess means that those other human species weren't created in God's image, just Homo sapiens. Sorry, Bill. Next up, Christians have to believe that thousands or billions of years after creation, depending on which creation model you embrace, God finally got around to giving people some direction on how to live, or at least how he'd like them to live. And when I say people, I mean a very small group of people rather than humanity as a whole. Brilliant, really, when you think about it, but even more so if you don't. Of course, Christians have to believe that God finally gave his people guidance only after allowing these good folks to be enslaved for nearly 400 years in Egypt, a place where they left absolutely no evidence of their nearly 400-year enslavement. Impressive. After which these people, now numbering in the millions, miraculously escaped Egypt and wandered in the desert for 40 years, once again leaving absolutely no trace of having ever been there. It's like a David Copperfield special. It was during this time in the desert that God gave the prophet Moses the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, meaning that Christians have to believe that God told Moses a story of creation which suggested the universe, our earth, and humans are very recent creations, never once mentioning the term mytho-history, to Bill Craig's chagrin. Christians also have to believe that this all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God has a very different set of priorities from what we might imagine. For instance, they have to believe that God expressly forbade the eating of shellfish and pork, the wearing of linen and wool together, etc., but somehow forgot to forbid rape or the selling of their daughters into slavery. Christians have to believe that this all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God was entirely preoccupied not with the incredibly valuable moral lessons we've learned over the centuries about how we ought to treat each other, but rather with the proper way to slaughter a bull, a goat, or a dove, and exactly where to sprinkle the blood. That's very important, by the way, where to sprinkle the blood, because bloodstains are a bitch, am I right? Christians also have to believe that this all-loving God, having just freed his people from slavery, then gives his people instructions on how to practice slavery properly. Because all-loving gods can't have their people mucking up the slave trade, right? And you definitely need to clarify who can and who cannot be a sex slave. That goes without saying. Christians also have to believe that their all-knowing God had and has yet absolutely no clue when it comes to female biology, requiring the death penalty for brides who fail to show evidence of a broken hymen on their wedding night, as though the hymen can't break prior to intercourse or remain intact even after intercourse. Perhaps God turned off his all-knowingness just like Mr. Deity. Then Christians have to believe that our all-loving God really wanted his newly freed people to have a very particular piece of land, which, despite his being all-powerful and completely able to painlessly Thanos snap the allegedly awful people living there into oblivion, he ordered this newly freed people to commit genocide, telling them to leave alive nothing that breathes. This includes babies, toddlers, and animals, including Sparky and Mr. Twiggles. Now, if you're rightly worried about what that kind of brutality might do to God's people, having to murder innocent babies, toddlers, and animals, fear not, because God allowed his people, well, his guys, to take the virgin girls back home to meet the folks, have their heads shaved, and take a 30-day vacay before they're forced to marry the men who slaughtered their friends, families, livestock, and, of course, Sparky and Mr. Twiggles. Next up, we have the main event, which is perhaps history's greatest understatement, as the life, death, and resurrection of God's only begotten Son is the only event in the 13.8 billion year history of our universe which has any genuine meaning or value. It is the event for which the entire universe was created and in which all people must believe to secure their salvation. And yet, what Christians must believe is that their God, having literally all the time in the world to plan this event and its documentation so that we might be saved, left humanity without even a single eyewitness, instead preferring that the documentation of this most important event, billions of years in the making, be left to anonymous authors who never even claim to be eyewitnesses. Christians must believe that no one involved with this most important event left even a word for history, but that God ceded this task to a number of Greek-speaking non-eyewitnesses who wouldn't get around to documenting things for 35 to 60 years, who were then forced to rely on word of mouth and decades of legendary development, which can be seen in the various gospel stories themselves. In the gospel attributed to Mark, overwhelmingly agreed by scholars to be the first gospel written, it's not even clear who Jesus is. And when he does rise from the dead, there's not a single post-resurrection appearance of our risen Lord. 30 years later, however, the author of John's Gospel has Jesus coexisting with God before the creation of the universe. He has Jesus walking through walls like a T-1000. And, of course, John has Jesus giving his crew some handy tips on where they might get some action on their fishing trip. Curiously, John fails to mention Jesus' alleged appearance to the 500, or his hanging around with the disciples for 40 days. Though he does mention that shortly after Jesus' resurrection, he had not yet ascended to the Father, to God. Because this timeless, spaceless being is somewhere up there. You know, where heaven is. Just right up there, right above the firmament. The authors of Mark and Luke simply copy most of Mark's gospel, sometimes word for word, adding birth narratives which neither align with each other nor comport with known history. There was no census where everyone had to return to their hometown from 1,000 years ago, nor was there any slaughter of boys under age 2, or people rising from their graves upon Jesus' death. Christians must believe that God, knowing our salvation was entirely dependent on believing in this one event, would leave us with such underwhelming evidence when he knew others would tell similar tales both before and after, and that people would gravitate instead to the tales told and embraced by their cultures and family traditions, with no way to definitively discern which tale we must or ought to believe. Christians must also believe that despite Jesus coming to give life and to give it more abundantly, the Holy Spirit did not spread this tale throughout the world at light speed to all nations of the earth. Instead, this all-loving God continued to allow the vast majority of his children to remain in darkness, unaware that the blood sacrifice required by a God who simply could not forgive his poorly designed creatures had been executed. Pun intended. Christians also have to believe that despite Jesus telling his disciples that he'd be right back,
I'll be back,
telling them that some of them would not taste death before he returned, dragging his kingdom behind him, despite that, we're all still waiting for that day, some 2,000 years later, and counting. Oh, and let's not forget that Jesus also told his disciples that only the Father knew when he'd return. Whoops. Christians must also believe that despite Jesus telling his followers that they would do greater works than he did, having raised the dead, cured all manner of disease, and caused newly demon-possessed pigs to turn lemming, his followers can do none of these things, even when two or more gather together and ask in Jesus' holy name. However noble the cause. Finally, Christians have to believe that God created a place of eternal torment for people like me who, through no fault of their own, fail to be convinced by such insufficient and poorly planned evidence. They have to believe that their all-loving God created me and my ilk, knowing I was fated to suffer for all eternity, when he could have just left me and my comrades in our prior non-existent state, where we were all perfectly content. Who among us would be so cruel and sadistic? If you can believe all this stuff with a straight face, if these stories somehow soothe your existential angst and keep you from being a colossal prick to your friends, neighbors, and family, then more power to you. Just don't vote, please. On the other hand, if deep down you find this stuff as ridiculous as I do, just let it go. You'll be all right. Trust me. Plus, you'll free up your Sundays and your mind. Once again, I'm me. Thanks for watching.